The gang to Paul's meeting will be presented by Gerard Musician, who is a lecturer in economics at Mount Royal and vice president for research at the Frontier Center. So thanks for joining us in person today, Gerard, and looking forward to your book.
The sharing economy. Okay, so yes, thank you very much for having me, and I'm glad I kind of went after that discussion because it's very good to hear some of the points and the language that is used, certainly. So my task here today is to give you the free market perspective of the sharing economy, or what we call the gig economy. So I have a presentation here, and I'm hoping that it'll all work because I'm not familiar with this. So let's try it. There we go. Okay. So the sharing economy. Basically, what we think about from the sharing economy's perspective, or the gig economy, is it's really a story of what we call creative destruction and the erosion of barriers to entry. Okay, so basically a barrier to entry is anything that would prevent some firm or some individual getting into a particular industry. Okay, and obviously, as you've heard, you know, the speakers earlier today and just the previous speaker, there are people that are for and people that are against. So those that are against have some very strong arguments. And it's everything from the current arguments that you hear, that you've seen on the news with respect to Uber or Airbnb, and those are the poster childs of the sharing economy. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about. To the ones that support it. And so it's kind of a 50-50 sort of toss-up depending on who you talk to. Now, before I get into my presentation, how many people actually have used Uber or Airbnb? Okay, so then that's a pretty easy gig, I'm thinking, from my perspective. But so simply put, for those that have used it, I mean, obviously you've experienced the service firsthand. You may have had a great experience, you may have had a not so good experience. Okay, so let's talk about Uber in and of itself, and because generally speaking, the information that we do hear about Uber and its growth rate is that it's a phenomenal growth rate, but as an economist, I kind of go, or have a tendency to go with numbers and the image or the graph. So if we look at this one, this is Uber's growth rate across the US starting in 2009 and moving up to 2014. And what this is showing us is 50 of the largest US cities, metropolitan areas, and just how quickly, within basically 5 years, Uber has expanded. And so essentially what you're looking at here is Uber had expanded to 100% of these 50 largest cities. So if you follow business at all, that's pretty phenomenal in terms of a growth rate. And from an economics perspective, we can think, or from a market perspective, we can think of it that if there was really no demand and consumers did not like the service and appreciated the value that the service brought, then we certainly wouldn't see such a rapid expansion of this particular service. Now the other, if you will, poster child of the sharing economy or the gig economy is Airbnb. So this is Airbnb's growth rate, once again, across the US, which has more comprehensive data than obviously Canada. But as again, you can see, after 5 years of growth, we basically went up to about 30 to 40,000 listings straight across the US. And again, if you think about it in terms of a business model, that's quite phenomenal, like regardless of what industry, what business you're familiar with. So I always like to start out discussing the sharing economy with these sort of metrics, just to give us some kind of clear indication as how quickly these type of services have spread. All right, so unfortunately, you've probably seen this, and hopefully you wish to forget it, but in order for me to explain the sharing economy and its benefits from a free market perspective, we need to kind of look at or review a little bit of our simple or basic economics. So generally speaking, most markets, as you're probably well aware of, operate on a basis of demand and supply. And so most of you in your undergraduate, fortunately, you had to take economics, which kind of keeps me employed. So I'll just go over this very quickly. What we have is we have basically demand, which simply states that as we demand more for a service and as the price gets smaller, we will want more of that particular service. hence the downward sloping line. Supply is the opposite, is upward sloping, which simply means as the price in the economy goes up, people are more and more willing to supply that service. Now, for most of you that are law students or that are lawyers, you'll experience this. If you're going to get paid more doing corporate law, then you'll have a tendency to gravitate toward corporate law. If there's no money in wills and estates, chances are you might not actually take that up. So again, it's pretty basic regardless of what market you're looking at. And what we see in a market when we don't skew it or we don't get involved, we just leave it alone, is basically an equilibrium price and quantity. The amount of services, if you will, that people are willing to supply at a price equaling the amount of services that people are demanding at that price. Okay, so we basically get the same thing regardless of which market we talk about. Now, with the other types of markets that we have in our economy is what we kind of call protected markets. A protected market is simply where we restrict the amount of output, the amount of production, or the amount that you can purchase. And when we have a restriction in terms of the quantity, a couple of things happen to your basic market. The first thing is, as you can see here, what you'll notice is that the quantity will be diminished. So basically we were here before, and now all of a sudden when we do a restriction, meaning there's not as much services to be had, we have this restriction in quantity. When we restrict the quantity, essentially what happens is that the protected industry, will be able to charge a higher price. Why? Because there's less amount, and again, consumers are willing to pay a higher price when there's less amounts. Now there's two effects that happen whenever we restrict any sort of market. The first effect is what we call a reduction in consumer surplus. And simply in economic terms, what that means is you're paying a higher price than you would have otherwise. So in other words, if you went to buy a loaf of bread at the store and you paid $5 and you could have got it for $3, then what happens is because you couldn't get it for $3, a lower price, and you had to pay the higher price, you basically erode your surplus, your benefit. And as you know, if you have to pay a higher price, that price has to come from some other reduction in your consumption. So maybe you don't put that other $2 in your gas tank, what have you. Okay? But more so as an economist, what we would argue from an economics perspective is this problem here. And this problem here is what we refer to as a deadweight loss. And essentially what a deadweight loss does in society is by restricting a market, we limit the amount of the product that we could have had. Okay, so in other words, in this particular example here, we're just talking about quantity of taxi cabs. If we would have left the market alone, we would have had much more cabs that were available to us at a cheaper rate. But because we went and we restricted the market, we've caused higher costs to the consumer and a reduction in the amount of cabs that were available. Now the thing to remember about it, what we call a deadweight loss, is once we lose those number of cabs, they're gone forever. Basically, we've given up or we've forgone that service and we can never get it back. Okay? So when you look at taxi cabs, they may not mean too much because you're looking for a cab and you couldn't get it. But when you're looking at it in terms of, let's say, healthcare, that's hospital beds. That is people that could have been treated that unfortunately weren't treated. Okay, which is a little bit more serious than your cab ride home after the bar. So what does this all mean when we look at it? Well, we generally look at disruption or the sharing economy in the sense of what Joseph Schumpeter wrote back in 1942, what's called creative destruction. And simply put, what he wrote about was that in order for us to have new markets, right, what we will see when we don't interfere with the market is this industrial mutation. Essentially what happens is new firms will come along and they will disrupt the old firms. So the old firms get wrapped up in the way they're doing things, and as they get wrapped up in the way they're doing things, the new younger firms, if you will come along and displace them, causing what we call creative destruction. Okay? And this idea of creative destruction, it's essential to capitalism. That's how capitalism works. So today, You are the younger generation moving into the shoes of the older generation. If you are faster, more efficient, then you will dominate the industry. It's just that simple. Okay? And it doesn't matter what industry we look at, we see this sort of creative destruction continually happening. Okay? All right, so let's go back to Uber for a moment. So in 2017, what we did was Frontier, we did a little bit of a quick study to see what our Uberlessness was in Canada. And it's simply put, if you look at this chart, we only have 3 provinces, Quebec, Ontario, and Alberta, that actually have Uber operating. Okay, so even though there's been a massive spike down in the US, we're slowly coming along. And obviously some of these provinces are engaged currently in the fight, if you will, in the debate of whether or not they should allow Uber or not. Now, for those of you who have taken Uber, you know, the process of catching an Uber is much different experience, if you will, than that of calling a cab. Essentially, you could be anywhere at any time, turn on your phone, hit the button on the app, and it'll come up and it'll find a driver for you that's within the vicinity, and they will come and pick you up and away you go. Okay, so much different than calling a cab company, you know, telling them kind of where you are and come pick you up and take you to your destination. But it's kind of interesting when we look at this, because as we go across the country, and most of you have probably read excerpts from the mainstream media about the debate. We want Uber, we don't want Uber. You talk to, you know, and once again, we have some people on one side saying, yes, we want it, other people saying, no, we don't want it. Okay? Now, what about Airbnb? If we look at Airbnb just in Canada, okay, so what this stats tell you, on this side we have the Airbnb growth rate in Canada over 15 to 16, and we have the growth rate for the Canadian hotel room industry. And what you can see, obviously, between 2015 and 2016, a massive amount of growth in terms of Airbnb, 93%, staggering, right? But the predominant thought is, as Airbnb sets up, it's going to displace this old industry, or the hotel industry, if you will. Unfortunately, when we look at the numbers, the hotel industry, if you look at the amount year over year, they're still growing approximately 1% per year. So again, it is a numbers, it's a number, and of course if you pulled a different set of numbers, you might find, you know, it's a different solution. But what this tells us is that the fact that even though you have this alternative cropping up, massive change, 93% in the market over 1 year, your traditional hotel industry is still expanding. And if you think about it in terms of destruction, you would think that the hotel industry would be in a massive decline. Now, if some of you have traveled across the country, you will notice, in particular when you go through Ontario, the old mom and pop roadside motels, all boarded up. Okay, so as the hotel industry and mainstream chains came online, those ones were displaced. As your cars were able to travel longer distances, there was no more need for the mom and pop little hotel, or motel rather, on the side of the road. Okay, so once again, that industry kind of went to the wayside as the new chains increased. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about restrictions. So again, you've heard numerous things about the restrictions that are out there, so I thought I'd just kind of capture some of them, what we call barriers to entry. Now, granted, each one of these barriers could have an alternative reasoning behind them for whatever the reason may be, but I'll just give you an example of the hosting restriction. So again, hosting deals with the Airbnb if you're sharing your properties. Okay. So what we see as general types of barriers are limited rental times. So essentially, in some jurisdictions, we'll see municipalities or provinces come out and literally say, you can't rent your Airbnb between this date and this date. Again, limiting the amount of time or the availability that you could use your Airbnb or your capital. The other one is registration, permit, business licenses. That is all standard, you know, in businesses of any sort. But again, if you have to pay for a permit, if you have to pay for a business license, it drives up your cost of offering that service. The other one is prohibited short-term bookings. So again, this kind of ties into the landlord-tenant sort of situation, where you have individuals who may own property and decide they could make more money, especially in a rental control situation, make more money doing an Airbnb than actually renting it to the tenant. And so again, one of the things that we talk about with respect to the sharing economy is your rights as a capital owner. I mean, you own the capital, you own the condo, you own the house. Do you have any rights to use your own personal capital to make gain? Okay. And then, of course, rent control. Now, the three top reasons that we see come out for these barriers are simply this: safeguarding of the public. Municipalities will have the authority to determine the right accommodation mix. And in a tight rental market, when you have Airbnb, it just makes it worse, essentially. Okay? So usually when we see these barriers being erected, this is kind of some of the reasoning behind them. With ride sharing, what we've seen is everything from driver fingerprinting to vehicle inspection, licensing restrictions, obviously. Background checks was a big one for drivers, and in particular here in Manitoba is the motor vehicle liability insurance. So that's on the rise. And in fact, in some locales, what we also see is limits on where and how you can, where and when you can pick people up, right? So you can't pick them up downtown, you can't pick them up in front of the casino, etc. Again, all designed for specific reasons, whatever those reasons may be, but generally what we see is reasons for these barriers are, again, safeguarding of the public, municipalities to determine the mix of their public transportation systems, and to create a level and fair playing field. So once again, when you look at restrictions, it's not necessarily an issue of, well, the restriction is not warranted, but the restriction in some cases is a method to reduce the entry. So in other words, you may not necessarily need it. So I heard just previously the panels. And so if some of you may not be old enough to remember, but I remember the panels used, that's fairly new. That's not always been. And the panels came in, reason why was because cab drivers were being robbed. So basically somebody would jump over the seat, take all the cabbie's money and bolt out of the cab or assault them, etc. Again, different system. In a Uber sense or a ride-sharing sense, there's no cash. So the only thing that really is of any value may be the person's iPhone. Okay? So again, some of these restrictions you need to think about. All right, so incessantly revolutionizing economic structure from within, destroying the old ones, and creating new ones. Now, this is kind of interesting, especially being in Winnipeg, because this isn't the first time this has happened, in particular in the transportation or in the cab industry. Most of you probably are too young to remember. Well, I'm too young to remember. I had to do the research on it. But essentially, the Canadian taxi cab wars lasted from 1925 up to 1950. And Winnipeg and Vancouver were front and center of these wars. And what we had back then is, and this is what happened in Winnipeg, is that essentially you had old operators and you had new operators. When the new operators got into the market, got around the barriers to entry, the immediate thing that we saw during the wars was fares fell. They plummeted. They plummeted almost down to the level of public transit, which meant now you as a consumer had a choice. If you wanted to go to work by cab, it would cost you almost the same as catching the local bus or the tram. Okay? Now all of a sudden, with open competition in the market, in 1938, Winnipeg had 50 cab companies for you to choose from. And today I believe you have 2. And in fact, it's only 1, because I believe Unicity and Duffy are somewhat related. Okay? Again, did the wages go down? Absolutely. Did it call on those 50 cab companies to come up with innovative techniques in order to service the market? Absolutely. Paint your cab a different color, put a nicer sign on it, advertise, advertise, advertise. Okay? On this side, what we have is the old line companies is what they called it. And this is what the old line companies had. They had very high barriers to entry, which mean it cost you a lot of money to get into the industry. You needed to have a specially purpose-built cab. I believe it was 9 passengers. They needed to own a telephone switchboard back then in order to take the calls to dispatch the cabs and to service the public. They needed taxi meters in the cab so that the drivers could be tracked in terms of their fares. They had garages, taxi stands. So a taxi stand is very much like a bus stop. You go to the stand, you pick up the cab, and away you go. And they also paid hotel and railway concessions, which simply meant they wanted to park out front of the hotel here. They would pay the hotel some money for the right to sit out front and collect fares. Okay? All this together, very high cost for them, very big investment, means high fares. In order to service that debt or those costs, you needed to charge a higher fare. In came the new operators. The new operators got around the barriers to entry simply because the government, the municipal government, didn't really enforce the taxi regulations as much. So if a guy went out and started his own cab company, it wasn't a big deal. They're not going to chase him or her around the block because they're driving the cab. But here's what happened. They started to use standard passenger cars, so just normal, right off the line car, right? They started to use what we call taxi brokers, and most of you are familiar with that for today. Basically what that meant is they would hire one individual to answer the phone, and then they would dispatch the cabs. So we're sharing that dispatcher, opposed to having our own telephone switch operator. They started to share garages. They also started in on what's called zone fares, meaning if you wanted to travel around downtown Winnipeg, you just pay your 50 cents and you go wherever. Okay? What this all meant, or then the last thing that they started to do is they said, you know, we're not paying the hotels and the railway anymore. What we're going to do is we're just going to park on the public street. And if you were looking for a cheap cab ride back then you would go and you'd find it. If you didn't want to go and looking for a cab, then you'd simply go to the old line companies. So what happened was they were able to offer these much cheaper rates because they didn't have all this other stuff that the other companies needed to pay for. In the end, what ended up happening is the consumer now could catch a cab. It wasn't a luxury anymore, meaning if you wanted to go from point A to point B, you could easily catch a cab just like somebody who was very wealthy. So as the battle raged from 25 to 50, what was the outcome? Well, lo and behold, the outcome was protectionism won out. And what ended up happening is the old line companies lobbied the government for protection because their industry was in decline. They just could not compete. And not only did the cab companies, I mean rightly so, if you have that much money invested and you need to make so much money in order to make that old technology run, you're going to protect it. It's no different than our cab drivers today. If you spent $100,000 on a cab license, you are going to fight tooth and nail to protect it. I mean, it's as simple as that. What we also seen was the transit companies. The transit companies weighed in as well, saying, listen, you know, we can't have these independent operators simply because we've got the monopoly on public transportation. So having the fares as cheap as what ours is, you're now cutting in on our basically on our turf, on our market. And so together, the old line companies, who were efficient at the time, and the transit companies basically brought in the regulation or the regulatory regime that we kind of see today. Okay? So that's a little bit of history. So it's not new what we see. Okay? It's a little bit newer because we got a little bit more different technology, but this idea created destruction, it's been here before. Okay? All right. So what does that leave us? Well, a couple of arguments that I'd like to just quickly share with you is, does ride sharing cost jobs and reduce wages? Okay, and that's a predominant one. In a study by Berger, they did a study across Los Angeles, New York, and San Francisco, and in fact, they did a pre-Uber and a post-Uber introduction. And pre-Uber and post-Uber introduction, what they discovered, based on their research, was that in all three cities, the number of taxi cab drivers went up. Not only did the taxi cab drivers went up, but the amount of money, their mean wage, also went up. And what also went up was the self-employed taxi drivers. So interesting enough that one of the biggest predicament is that their wages, which are supposed to plummet and go down, in these three cities, based on this research, it actually kind of went up. And so to explain this, one of the things you can think about is simply choice. Some people I would, some people may say, I'll never get in the back of somebody's personal car. I like to drive in a cab. That's their choice. Great, right? And some people say, it doesn't matter to me whether I get in the back of my buddy's car or an Uber driver's car. I just need to get from point A to point B, okay? The other thing that we find is we talk about Airbnb. Now in Airbnb, this is kind of interesting. So we were talking earlier about the number of Airbnb, and rightly so. One of the big arguments out there is these entire homes. So if I own an entire home, I'm leasing it out as an Airbnb, and that's a bit problematic, and that's on the rise. That's a majority of what people perceive. So let's just take a look at some Canadian data. So here's Winnipeg 2016. Right now we've got about 7,700 hotel and Airbnb units in Winnipeg. Out of that 7,700, 650 are Airbnb units, total Airbnb units. Out of that, only 260 are entire units, which means that if the hotel inventory is 71, then only 8% is your Airbnb rentals, and out of that 8%, only 4% constitute entire homes. So really, it's not a staggering number that we're actually dealing with. It's relatively small, okay? Now, if you look across the board, obviously Montreal, much higher, right? Toronto, much higher. And again, you have these very, very expensive cities if you've ever traveled, and now it's all of a sudden accessible. So if you wanted to go to Montreal, before maybe you couldn't afford to go because of the hotel or what have you, now it's not a big deal. You can go there, you can catch an Uber, you can stay at an Airbnb, and now you're in that city and you are promoting tourism within that city. Before it was inaccessible, okay? But the big question for hotel industry is it's costing us money. So there was a study done out of Texas, and what they did was they looked and they analyzed throughout Texas the amount of Airbnb increase versus how much revenues the hotel industry lost. And what they found was, for every 1% Airbnb increase, the hotel industry lost 0.05% in revenues. Simply means you need to have a 20% hike in Airbnb before the hotel industry will lose 1% revenue share. And what that tells us simply is, again, choice. Some people have no problem staying at an Airbnb. Other people say, you know what, I just don't like staying in somebody's house. I mean, I'm down from Calgary. I love my in-laws, but I just don't like staying at their house, so I'll stay at a hotel, right? So again, when we look at these numbers, it gives us a little bit more of a perspective in terms of these two sort of industries or gig economy participants. So what does that leave us? Well, we got three things that we can say. Societies will always be tempted to block process of creative destruction by implementing policies to resist economic change. And that's just normal. I mean, if somebody came along and threatened the legal industry, we had this years ago with respect to paralegals, right? Once again, you're going to protect your own industry because you're in it, okay? And so that's no different than any other industry that we see, okay? So it is just a natural thing. If you have a lobby group out there that's saying, listen, protect us, and you're lobbying your government will react, okay? Next thing is that what we find historically, economically, is that when we attempt to save jobs, generally it backfires. And how it backfires is that instead of the market knocking the business out, inefficient producers actually get to hang on and become even more inefficient. And they're usually, at the end of the day, it just costs you, the consumer, or you, the taxpayer, a lot more money than if the market would have cleaned it up in the first place. And I believe you guys are having some sort of issue with, is it your hydro company or something along those lines? So once again, this we'll always see in most industries that are, if you will, protected. And last but not least, it saps incentives to introduce new products and production methods, leading to stagnation, layoffs, and bankruptcies. So what we have is usually when we try to protect an industry and we keep it going, and it's stagnant, eventually there's a catastrophic failure at some point, which is worse than, let's say, having culled it out of the market long before its due date, if you will. Okay. All right, so the free market policy perspectives. Well, as we can see, we can continue to go down the route and protect the old industries, if you will, the old line, or we can go and embrace the future. Now, is embracing the future very easy? Do you just turn the page and say, yes, let's embrace it? No, there are challenges. Of course there's challenges. There are some real serious questions, and especially as have been mentioned, as lawyers, you need to face these challenges. Privacy, workers' rights. But again, do we protect an industry for those, or do we look and seek some other sort of alternative legislation, something that pertains to that, rather than holding down progress, if you will? So we have basically three items to leave you with, is reduce regulatory barriers to entry. Open it up. Why are we protecting these companies? What do we have to gain by limiting our choices? Okay? Protection of somebody who's in a business that is not being competitive. Are we concerned about that individual, making sure that if they're inefficient at producing, that they continue to operate in that business, or should it be time for them to move on to a different job? Okay. Second one is encourage competition. Once again, instead of writing legislation to deny competition, why don't we look at legislation that would encourage competition? I mean, there's nothing wrong with competition. Each of you that were in school, you go through this process. If, I say this to my students every day. If I came in and I say I'm going to give everybody an A+, how many people would bother showing up the next day? Right? If there's only so many of you who do the work will get the higher mark, that's why they do the work. Right? Last but not least is we must embrace innovation. If anything has taught us this, it is the state of the world that we're in today. Innovation is moving fast. Autonomous cars are coming. They're not going to be shut down or shut out, and they shouldn't be. Are there some challenges to them? Absolutely. But if we start to slow progress, then we'll be left behind. Because if we don't adopt the progress, whether it's provincially or municipally, or even state-wise, nationally, then the next country will. And as we can see, if you look across the countries, those that are always embracing innovation will do much better than those that cling to the past and to the traditional sort of old line industries. Okay. And that is all I have to say about the sharing economy.